word of life.
Thanks be to God. Our gospel this morning is taken out of John chapter 10, verses 22 through 30. Glory to you, Lord. At that time, the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. And Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. So the Jews gathered around him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." And Jesus answered them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me. But you do not believe because you are not among my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one." Here ends the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. Well, we got a special treat today. So as I usually try to work ahead and with my sermons and try to plan out. And as I was thinking through the idea of a Mother's Day, Jill came and talked to me, and she basically said that God has been sharing some things with her about a particular person in the Old Testament, a mom. And so as we were talking, I felt that she should be the one to bring the word. So I asked her to come, and she'll come, and she's going to share a special Mother's Day message to moms. And us guys, we just get to hear along. How about that? So,
here, take that. All right. Yes, I felt it was appropriate on Mother's Day to have a message by a woman about a woman for women. Because women are the heart of the home. And one thing you'll find out about me, that I'm more of a teacher than a preacher, so you're going to get a lot of content coming at you. Wes, you can turn my 20-minute timer up there. So I got it timed. But, women, the heart of the home, they're the ones that are going to give you a warm hug or a warm meal. They're the ones that are going to remember your birthday, host the holiday meals, be a taxi service, care for sick family members. But at times, we're so busy caring for others that we forget to care for ourselves. And the heart is the hardest working muscle in the body. So think about the women. They're the hardest working part of that home, the heart of the home. And I have here a heart that was made by Tammy Doder, so special thanks to her. We're going to be looking at the heart of an Old Testament woman. Her name was Bathsheba. And her story is found in 2 Samuel. So what I want to do is tell you her story. I'm going to be reading from the scripture, but kind of interjecting some additional comments. So, does anybody remember who Bathsheba was? She's the woman taking the bath, right? So God has a sense of humor there with her name being Bathsheba. So, 2 Samuel chapter 11. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab, who was his commander, out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. And they destroyed the Amorites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. And one night, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. And the woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. Now, the messenger reported back, "She is Bathsheba. She is daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite." Now, those names don't mean anything to us, but they meant something to David, because those two men, Bathsheba's father and her husband, were listed in the top 30 warriors that David had, and that list is found in 2 Samuel 23. It didn't stop him, though. He still sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her, and then she went back home. And sometime later, she sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." So where do we find Bathsheba? Well, first of all, we know she came from a God-fearing family. She was a young bride. She had no children. We're going to call her about 18 years old. Okay? Her husband is off fighting at the war, so she is alone. And being a Jewish woman, her main reason for living was to produce children, especially sons. Well, that's not going to happen with her husband being off fighting. So what is she doing with all her time? And as women, it can sometimes be difficult when we're such caretakers of our family and there's no family to take care of. So what was she doing? Was she worrying, praying for her husband, waiting for him to come home? Maybe she was feeling lonely. And in this particular night, she was out bathing in her inner courtyard. And she thought that no one could see her. And no one could except someone who was up on a roof, of course. So we find that she is alone. Now, she sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. What was she feeling that night when she was called to the palace? She probably thought that she was hearing word about her husband, or maybe from her father. Maybe the men were back from fighting. And so when she was called to the palace, she thought, okay, this is going to be word about my family. Instead, something completely different happened to her. We know King David was about 53 years old then. And she was basically forced into a relationship with him that night and then sent home. What was she feeling? Again, the Bible does not specify her feelings, but we're women. We know she left feeling shame, guilt. She's been unfaithful to her marriage vows through no fault of her own. She could be angry with God, angry with David. She's praying for forgiveness. So she's sent back home. Again, she's alone. She's confused. She's not going to share this information with anybody. She has to keep it locked in her heart. And now a month passes, maybe more than a month. David has made no further contact with her, so it was clearly just a one-night stand. But she's pregnant, and she's panicked. In that culture, could she perhaps have been, well, she would have been accused and perhaps stoned for being found pregnant out of marriage. So we have another piece of her heart. What we're doing was we're just looking at Bathsheba's heart and what is happening through the course of her life, through the things that are being allowed to happen in her life. So she sends word to David that she's pregnant. We don't know that David made any reply to her, but what he did do was send word to Joab, his commander, and he said, hey, send me Uriah the Hittite. So that is Bathsheba's husband. Uriah came back to David, and David said, yeah, how's Joab, and how's the war going, and how are the soldiers doing? And then he said, well, why don't you just go on down to your house and wash your feet? And what he was saying was, go be with your wife. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from King David was sent behind him to his house, but Uriah didn't make it to his house. He slept at the entrance to the palace with the master's servants. And when David was told, hey, Uriah didn't go down to his house, meaning the plot that you're trying to create here is not working. So King David called for Uriah again and said, why don't you go down to your house? And Uriah said, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in open country. How could I go down to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. So what did David do? He actually got Uriah drunk, thinking, well, maybe this will be the ticket to finally get him to go down to his home. He never went down. So in the morning, David sent a letter to Joab, and he sent this with Uriah back to the front lines. And the letter said, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is the fiercest, and then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die. So Uriah delivers his own death sentence to Joab. And sure enough, while the city was under siege, Joab put Uriah out in front where he knew the strongest defenders were, and Uriah the Hittite died. And they sent word back to David through a messenger, and David's response was to the messenger to go back to Joab and say, don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as it does another, so go ahead and press the attack against the city and destroy it. So, Bathsheba's husband is dead. And when she hears this, she mourns for him. Another piece of her heart. Her husband is dead. After the time of mourning is over, David brings her to his house, and she becomes his wife, and she bears this son that they had conceived together. But the thing that David did had displeased the Lord. So, God sends judgment on David. He sends Nathan the prophet to rebuke David through a story, and then he interprets the story. The interpretation is, why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his sight? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Amorites, and now therefore the sword will never depart from your own house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah to be your own. And David recognized his own sin and said, I have sinned against the Lord. And the prophet Nathan said, the Lord has taken away your sin, and you will not die. But because you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. And after Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck that child ill, and the child died 7 days later. So now we see that Bathsheba's desolation is complete. Broken heart syndrome is a real medical condition. You can die of a broken heart. But if we keep following Bathsheba's story, we see that she doesn't die. She not only survives, but she thrives. So David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. And the Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah. So in other words, Solomon gets his own pet name from the Lord because the Lord loved him. So what can we learn from Bathsheba that she was able to survive all of these tragedies? Well, one thing we know is that she allowed herself to experience emotion. So the Bible tells us that she mourned for her husband, and she also mourned for her child. And counselors today will tell us that if as women we have any unfinished mourning in our life, it can resurface at later times. For younger women, it can resurface at menopause. Older women, it can resurface at end of life. So we know that we have to grieve well, fully and completely. Every loss deserves appropriate grief, whether it's big or small. Speaking of the death of a loved one, even as recent, we'd say, as the Civil War, women would wear black for a year to pronounce to society that they were grieving. We don't do that anymore. We feel very awkward even when people cry around us, even at funerals. We want to pat them on the back. It's okay. You don't need to cry. But in the Old Testament at funerals, they passed around a little bottle, and every mourner would put a tear in that bottle, and they would bury it with the loved one to show the Lord, look how much this person was loved. So it's okay to grieve, and Bathsheba shows us that she did grieve for those that she lost. The second thing she did is she stopped blaming. She could have become a bitter woman, right? She could have held David responsible for the death of two people, her husband and her child. This was not a Disney romance, because I told you the age difference already, but David had 6 other wives plus concubines. But we know at some point they had they respected each other in the relationship. She had 4 more sons by him, and he promised to make Solomon his heir. Even though Solomon was not his firstborn, Bathsheba was not his first wife, but he promised her early on that Solomon would take the throne after him. What else did Bathsheba did? Well, she basked in the blessings. She did receive blessings from the Lord, even after all of the heartache that she experienced. God loved Solomon and even gave him a pet name. And the promise, of course, from King David that Solomon would be king next. And on David's deathbed, now David died when he was 64, so here we have Bathsheba about age 29, again losing a second husband at age 29. Solomon is 11 years old, and God blesses Solomon with wisdom. We know that story, right? Solomon was the wisest man ever to live, and God also gave him wealth and honor. He wrote 3,000 proverbs, over 1,000 songs, and he was the one to build the temple of the Lord. So what blessings she received through her son Solomon and God's blessing over Solomon's life. And the last thing we learn from her is that she transferred her wisdom. Instead of becoming bitter, she became better. And if you can be very creative here, you can see the word test. She was put to the test, but she came out the best. So instead of becoming bitter, she became better. In 1 Kings, we hear that Solomon actually had a throne brought in for his mother, set the throne at his right side. That's how much he respected his mother, that she would rule with him. And in Proverbs 31, and if you haven't read Proverbs 31, please read it today, all you ladies. That's actually, tradition says that it is a conversation between Solomon and Bathsheba. It's written by, it'll say, King Lemuel. That was what we believe to be Bathsheba's pet name for Solomon. And what she's telling him is, you need to find a godly wife. And she also tells him, don't spend your strength on women. In other words, don't be like your dad. Start a new legacy. Be a different type of a father. Bathsheba is also listed in the genealogy of Jesus. She's one of 4 women listed. So we can learn a lot from Bathsheba. She allowed herself to grieve. She stopped blaming. She received the blessings of God, and then she transferred her wisdom. We can benefit from her wisdom today. Solomon, the wisest man in the world, benefited from the wisdom of his mother. And so this morning I wanted to close with a song, which is really a prayer. If you can imagine Bathsheba singing this to Solomon, that he would put the Lord first in his life, he would choose a godly wife, and he would serve the Lord all his days and be in heaven for eternity.